Good morning. I'm Sven Cowan and I'm the Program Manager here at Quantum Spatial Canada. Today we're going to be talking about what's new, some of our innovations and LiDAR applications for trees and water. So first we want to say welcome to Day 2 of GeoIgnite 2020. Quantum Spatial Canada are first timers. We're new to this event. We had wanted to attend this year in person and meet as many of you as possible, but clearly, with everything that's happened, that wasn't going to be possible. So we did want to say that we hope everyone and their friends and family are safe and sound, but we want to make the most of our time together today, and we want to share a little bit with you about what we do. So here's a look at our agenda. It'll be a three-part presentation. I'll be starting with a quick introduction into who Quantum Spatial Canada is. And then I've got a couple of subject matter experts that are going to help me with the rest of the presentation. Dr. Andrew Brenner will give a section on forestry innovations, and then we'll have a section on our TOPOBATHYMETRIC solutions presented by my colleague Colin Cooper. And then at the end, we'll do a live Q&A. So who is Quantum Spatial Canada? Well, we're part of Quantum Spatial. Quantum Spatial has a significant history. We actually have aerial acquisition history going all the way back to 1930, beginning with imagery acquisition way back then. So imagery has been a core part of the business, focusing on multispectral, hyperspectral, thermal these days. But we're more well known now for our work in LiDAR, and we are the largest LiDAR provider in North America. Fixed and rotary wing terrestrial LiDAR, both topographic and topobathymetric. But we've also got expertise in unmanned aerial solutions, mobile mapping, and enterprise GIS. And we've won some awards for the work that we've done. Quantum Spatial is also an NV5 company, and NV5 is a leading provider of engineering and consulting services across North America and international. Quantum Spatial was acquired by NV5 in late 2019, and we've been working together to develop our geospatial solutions. By the numbers, Quantum Spatial is one of the largest geospatial firms in North America. We have over 600 employees spread across 10 offices in North America and internationally. Here's a look at our geographical footprint of our offices. We have locations all the way down from St. Petersburg, Florida, to here in Vancouver, British Columbia, where I'm located, and then all the way up to Anchorage, Alaska. And then we also have an international office in Bangalore, India. In terms of where we work, where our projects are located, really over much of North America. Just recently, we've done projects in all 50 US states, 7 Canadian provinces, 2 Canadian territories, as well as Mexico, Puerto Rico, and the Caribbean. So our acquisition assets are located throughout North America, but they can be mobilized pretty rapidly as project requirements dictate. Our pilots and our sensor operators are highly experienced. They're always thinking safety first, but they're able to acquire data in nearly any environment. So Quantum Spatial does a lot, and in the time we have together today, we're really just going to be able to scratch the surface. But we did want to take a deeper dive into a couple of specialty application areas, and that's why we picked forestry and hydrology. We thought that they would be important to the audience we have here today. And hopefully you'll learn something new about Quantum Spatial or about some of the work that we're doing. And if you have questions, please submit one to us during the live Q&A at the end of the presentation, or follow up with us afterwards. We'd love to hear how you might be using some of the technology that we're talking about today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, who will talk a little bit about our work in forestry. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. What I'm going to be talking about is how we can utilize LiDAR to identify individual trees in the forest. So looking at or seeing the trees from the forest. When we utilize LiDAR, we are really looking at a series of points that are reflected from the objects they hit. It could be the top of the canopy, it could be the middle of the canopy, it could be the bottom of the canopy. And the amount we can see really depends on the number of points that are sent out from the LiDAR sensor. So if we are looking at a 2 points per square meter LiDAR point cloud, we can sort of make out where the top of the canopy is, and we get a little bit below the canopy. If we then increase that to 4 points per square meter, we start to see the canopy developing. A few more points penetrate the canopy, get to the ground. If we now put that up to 10 points, we can now start to see the size and the shape of the trees, the ground. We're not getting much off the trunks, but we are getting to see the look and feel of the canopy. At 20 points per square meter, we can now identify these individual trees. We can see the branching structure. And at 40 points per square meter, we can now see the full extent of the canopy, all the branches. We're starting to get reflection off the tree trunks. We can see the penetration to the ground, and we see variation on the ground. The reason I showed you that is because the point density is very important in terms of what you can pull out from a forestry perspective. So what I want to do in the next few slides is I go into the idea of classifying an individual tree. Although LiDAR has been used in forestry in many different ways, this is specifically one that I think has a lot of potential as we go into the future. So why would we want to classify individual trees? Most foresters would think, hey, I've got enough problems with just the information I have on stands, but there are many cases where the individual tree will be really useful. So the basic unit in the forest is the tree. That's what we measure, that's what's harvested, that's what's grown, that's what's used by wildlife. So from a wildlife perspective, the individual tree is what it's all about. No one cares about the stand. And so why do we work in stands where we're really interested in individual trees? We work in stands because it's the practical solution. It's what we've spent centuries of research going into understanding how to sample a stand, because we don't have the ability to create a census. We can't count all the trees. We can't barcode all the trees with their information as much as we would like to. This technology really allows us to advance the science that way and get at the individual trees that make up the forest. Previously, this was impractical, it was impossible, but now we have the technology to actually bring that home. The conventional way of doing that is through the geometric approach. This way we identify the tops of the trees, and then we work out from the tops of the trees to the adjacent trees, so we can build a series of models that identify where one tree is, where it is relative to its neighbor tree, and we can get the information on the vertical distribution. We can also get information on what's happening on the ground below the tree, so we can really build a very complete picture of what that tree is experiencing and where it is. That allows us then to utilize that information on a landscape that we haven't surveyed. So here we have a landscape in Alaska, Prince of Wales, mainly conifer trees, and some areas of bare earth. And this way we can utilize the point cloud to identify individual trees using the geometric approach, because we got very similar canopies and they tend to be dominant by conifers. So by identifying those individual trees, we then have for each individual tree a series of lidar metrics that describe its structure. We can have a series of spectral metrics that describe the color and the reflectance. We got competition metrics that describe it relative to its adjacent trees. We have site and topographic metrics that relate to where it is on the landscape, and the health metrics will relate to how well it's growing. These all flow into information that allows us to predict the variables of interest, whether they deviate, whether they're canopy volume, whether they're biomass, whether they're timber. Now, to do this, actually being able to reliably segment the tree is important. We can see that we get pretty good tree segmentation using the geometric approach, using conifers, but it tends to fall apart when we then use less conical models, such as for broadleaf, or the density goes up, it's hard to differentiate tree canopies and such like. The other thing to understand about individual trees is that if you delineate it from LiDAR, we can really only see what the sensor detects. And so the sensor tends to detect what is in the dominant and codominant and not in the subdominant. So some of the challenges of bringing in imagery, so a lot of the feature extraction that's done from LiDAR is done purely from LiDAR, but we're throwing away a lot of the value of the other data source that we have, which is imagery. So our challenges are with imagery is that trying to get the imagery matching with the LiDAR can be pretty challenging because it could be collected at a different time, it could be collected with slightly different coordinates. And so when we bring that imagery in and we don't process it properly, we can bring a lot of noise into the statistics. So what we've done is develop a directional colorization approach that allows us to put a color on each of the LiDAR points. This allows us to create a sort of a true ortho colorization where we can remove lean, we can deal with occlusion, and it allows us to improve the data set to a point where we can use it for segmentation. So simplistically, we have a LiDAR point cloud. They have a series of beams that go down and reflect it off different parts of the canopy. And then we also have a series of frames that are collected at the same time or similar time to the LiDAR. What we're able to do, so we don't ortho-rectify to the ground because we know that the ground and the canopy are in different places. What we do is we trace that ray back and we identify the individual pixel that corresponds to that point on that LiDAR point on the canopy. So we can actually colorize the LiDAR point cloud with the actual, with the actual pixel from the image. Basically, this allows us to build, so it gives you an example here. This is a point cloud on the top, and this on the bottom shows which image was applied to which point on the canopy. We can do this with 4-band, we can do it with multispectral, with hyperspectral, we can do it with thermal. And so we can assign individual pixel values, we can assign indices, we can assign whatever we want, and then we can filter out the noise and ultimately improve the classification. Now this gives you an example here. Here's the ray tracing approach, is what we're calling it. So if we look at the red circle and the yellow circle, this is with the ray tracing. If we go to the next slide, we can see that if we ortho-rectify to the ground, that canopy moves. Now, that doesn't look like a significant movement from an ortho-rectification perspective, but it is from a spectral arrangement perspective. So if we're trying to use the right pixels on the right points, that becomes a problem. If we look at the yellow one, we go back to the ray trace product, we can see that there's a canopy right on that seam line. If we move to the ortho rectification project, that canopy disappears. And if we're trying to count trees, that can be a problem. So why is this important? Well, it's important if we want to bring all the information we can into some sort of classification. And we've found that moving from the geometric approach to the machine learning approach is actually pretty effective in moving it into complex canopies, particularly broadleafs. Basically, the machine learning approach allows us to look at how canopies exist in reality and then match it to the canopies in the data set. In order to do this, we have to have a large amount of training data sets. So you say how much, we say as much as we can afford to get. This then gets fed into a deep learning model that generates a probabilistic estimate of both the tree stem location, where the edge of the canopy is, and allows us to then build out individual models. And we do it iteratively until it represents what we expect the tree to look like. One of the big advantages of this is that we do not pre-assume the shape or the size or the look of a particular canopy. What we do need is a series of existing canopies that we can train the routine on. We've found that this then gives us much better results than if we were relying on an idealized geometric model. So this shows you in an urban area in Louisville, Kentucky. This is an area we collected with 4-band imagery and high-density lidar. This sort of gives you a 3D look. If we click now, then we can see how this individual deep learning algorithm has allowed us to identify these broadleaf canopies into both individual trees, but also the species associated with it. We weren't looking for all species in this particular study, but we're looking for particular species, particularly ash, related to the emerald ash borer. So if we zoom in now, we can start to see how the value of individual trees starts to become really important. We can look at where individual species are, we can look at the size, we can look at the structure, we can look at the greenness, we can look at the volume. If we zoom in here, this sort of shows you how we can now build a census of trees across a landscape. And yes, do we need to have it? Not necessarily, but does it prove useful to us? Pretty important. So we can identify individual trees, we can look at the health of individual trees, we can look at the canopy structure. We go to the next slide. We can zoom in here on this individual tree and then start to see that the information that's contained in the point cloud that now allows us to characterize that tree canopy. And if part of that canopy started to die back, we could then work out what some of the sources of that were. So finally, to wrap this up, do we need to map individual trees? Maybe, maybe not. If we do have the ability to map individual trees, is it useful? Absolutely. This is going to be one of those things that you didn't need it until you've got it, and now that you have it, you're going to need it. And I think that what we will see moving forward is how this individual tree delineation and the database that supports it allows us information that we previously never had, and will allow us to understand how the urban forest, how the natural forest, and how forest processes are working. So now I'd like to pass it on to my colleague, Colin Cooper, to talk about topobathymetric solutions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Colin Cooper, and I'm a technical domain expert for quantum spatial and lidar. I'll be taking the next few minutes to go over topobathymetric lidar. I'll cover what it is, how and why we use it, and go over some cool applications that we've been using these data sets for. Now, a focus area for our clients are mapping river systems and shorelines, whether that's support dam removal or habitat restoration. The problem with the traditional near-infrared LiDAR sensors are that their main area of interest, as you can see, is a giant black hole. So we solve for this by putting in the green laser system that penetrates the water column and starts to map the submerged topography. So that creates a seamless full resolution data set that they can now get the full picture and address their problems. So what is topobathy LiDAR? Like I mentioned, the big difference is the change in wavelength. We're going to a green wavelength, which can penetrate the water column. And when it does that, you'll see it'll slow down and it'll bend, and you have to correct that refraction. These systems are traditionally paired with the near-IR sensor that can support topo mapping, but it can also resolve the water surface, and you can use that for that refraction processing. So why use topobathymetric LiDAR? With these systems, you can cover large, expansive areas that you might not have been able to cover before with traditional survey methods, whether that's weighted RDK transect or single beam or even multi-beam. For shoreline, you're really covering an area that was traditionally difficult, if not impossible, to map with large-scale multi-beam operations. So you're filling in that shallow coastal area. But this technology doesn't work everywhere. The biggest drivers to success for any topobathy LiDAR project are going to be how clear is your water and what's the bottom reflectivity. Keep in mind that that laser beam needs to enter the water column, make it to the bottom, and bounce all the way back to the aircraft. So if the water is really turbid, it's going to lose power and not make it back. If it's aerated, it might scatter all the way. And of course, if there's floating vegetation in your stream, the laser's never going to penetrate that. So there are 3 primary sensors that we use. The first 2 are really designed to capture shallow water areas, and the third one, the Hawkeye, is a deep water system. The differences are the pulse rate and amount of energy per pulse. So the shallow systems are high pulse rate. They can resolve shallow depths and better feature detection and resolution there. While the Hawkeye is a lower pulse rate system, provides more energy per pulse though, and allows you to get greater depths. Flying the green laser has some considerable differences in relation to our usual flying with near-IR scanners. As mentioned, the green laser takes more energy to fire, so one of the things that we do is fly a lot lower to the ground. So it takes a lot more lines to cover the same area that you would with a Tier 1 topographic scanner. You have all the same challenges operationally that you need to consider, but now you're also adding in the water clarity. You need to know, is your water clear as gin or is it looking like chocolate milk? Is your bottom type going to be a nice bright white sand or is it going to be a mucky bottom? Beyond that, once you get into processing, the green LiDAR is more complex. You need to know the water surface model, and classification of the points gets a lot harder as well. So let's talk about that for a little bit. One of the complexities is that the laser will bend and slow down as it enters the water column, and you need to correct for that. To do that, you need to know where is that point of entry and what's the angle. So we call it water surface modeling. And it's really important because, as you see here, if you were just to take a flat water surface model, you would actually start to see waves in your ground model. You actually need to capture that wave appropriately to make sure that you're getting the right amount of correction on slowing down the laser travel in the water and the angle of refraction. Streams can be difficult too. You need to map the water surface, and if it's really calm, you might not get any water surface returns, so you might have to make a synthetic water surface, or there could be transverse gradients in your stream, and you need to make sure you're capturing that as well. But this is what our data looks like. Here's a project where the water is all masked out. So you can imagine if this was in your IR project, this is what your data set would look like when you're trying to study that stream. And you add in the topobathy LiDAR, and now you're mapping the full river system. And you're picking up a lot of detail of that submerged topography. And don't forget that we're also getting the topo returns. It's topo plus bathy. So we can zoom in on a cross-section, kind of look at it, and you can see we're getting full bank-to-bank coverage, and we're even firing underneath that vegetation to get that bank there. So standard product list, along with your normal topographic products, you get your classified point cloud. We can have full waveform captured and delivered as well. Then the main thing is the topobathymetric bare earth model. So it's that high resolution, seamless data model that you can use to support your mapping activities. You can get depth models. We generate intensity images. You can have the green wavelength reflectance along with the near IR reflectance. So you can actually have 2 products that you can look at now, more sources of information. We delineate the water's edge, and we also map where are the void areas, like where didn't we get results. We don't want to interpolate over that and assume that it's just flat from where you dropped off. It might have been getting deeper, and that's why you didn't get it mapped. So it's really important to deliver and express that in the product. So if you have voids, what do? Whether that needs to be filled in or not, that's up to the project design. There are the limitations, and one of the nice things about this is it's very complementary to sonar, where it's easy to capture the shallow areas. The boats have difficulty, but the boats can go capture the deep areas with the sonar beam. And this is what it would look like. So here's a typical survey, and you can see that we have some void areas. And what we did is go in and fill in with sonar. And it's a really cool way of doing a project is flying the LiDAR and providing that void layer to the sonar people, and they can go out and fill that void area in. And that cuts down on their operational costs, and it helps complete that model. There's considerations, you would probably like to fly the LiDAR when the water is shallow, where the boat-based sonar, you probably want a little higher water level so you can get that area of overlap. So how accurate are these systems? You can assess accuracy by collecting ground truth data with sonar, or in a lot of shallow water applications, we'll use GPS points by weighted transect. So obviously you want to have your tallest ground pro out there collecting points. What you'll see though is that it's spot on in a lot of cases. We are under 20 centimeter RMSE, and one of the things that I like to note here is that the resolution and the detail that you can pick up versus a weighted transect is magnitudes greater. So now that we have the data collected and processed and assessed for accuracy, what do we do with it, and how is it used? So now we'll cover some data applications. Some of the more obvious ones are going to be inundation modeling and nautical charting. TOPOBATHY LiDAR is going to provide high resolution, high accurate data sets that are going to improve your models, and they're going to cover more areas. And one of the cool things we do is we normalize the intensity for depth. And what that does is it corrects for that attenuation of the laser travel in the water column, and it allows features that have the same brightness level when they're shallow as to whether they're deep. And that opens the door for benthic habitat mapping. Seagrass, is it coral, is it a reef patch? All these advanced analytics for feature extraction that have been developed for terrestrial landscapes can now start to be applied to these bathymetric landscapes. Again, the major thing we do is we chart larger, shallow areas that have previously been logistically prohibitive. We're doing shoreline work for NOAA, where we're mapping areas that haven't been mapped since the 1800s. There's a whole wealth of riverine applications now available beyond the traditional NOAA survey approach, particularly in reference to fisheries and in-stream habitat, where we can now map and quantify features such as coarse woody debris and submerged vegetation. We can also start to apply some of this fine-scale geomorphic classifications to your entire river system, which was never really feasible for a number of reasons with traditional field surveys. These analyses are objective, they're reproducible, so they can support restoration, monitoring, and management activities. A lot of this was developed by my buddy, and I think he did it really to just find the fishing holes for himself, but we'll all benefit from it. This data supports inundation mapping, as mentioned, and this can be from simple flood modeling scenarios to more advanced hydrologic modeling. And here you can see both coastal and riverine applications where understanding where the water can go has obvious value. Here's an example of flood inundation. We have normalized the terrain elevation to the water surface, and then we iteratively raise the water level to see how different areas are going to be impacted. We can quantify the connectivity of off-stream habitat at different discharges or breach potential of levees and dikes. This has obvious implications for developed properties, insurance, risk mitigation, infrastructure engineering, you name it. Through multiple acquisitions, we can start to accurately map erosion, deposition, and overall sediment dynamics. So here are some examples of change detection in braided river systems. We have one contract where we've been flying annually for 5 years now to track the sediment dynamics to support habitat assessment, inform restoration and management of the river system. So it's pretty neat to be able to go back and see how dynamic these river systems are. There are implications for using this data to support infrastructure planning and design. This could be for site characterization, for construction or dredging. We've flown several dams to support both dam operations and removal. So how much water are we going to be able to release, and where's it going to go? All that stuff. And as we move to the next slide here, in the upper right is an example of such an operation where we used sonar to complete the survey. And we captured the whole dam this way, so now you can calculate your capacity level depending on the water surface elevation. Another interesting project we've had was to map lake volumes in Alaska, and this is to mitigate the impact of ice road construction and further optimize their process. So really neat data set. And I would be remiss if I didn't bring up NOAA's coastal mapping program. Here we have one of the largest efforts surrounding the technology, and their goal is to map the shoreline of the United States and update nautical charts. Like mentioned, there are areas that really haven't been updated since using plumb lines in the 1800s. There's also just an accessibility to boat-based operations, or that's very cost prohibitive to do something like that. So these data sets, they also go beyond their primary application of shoreline mapping, and they feed into a lot of other tools and efforts going on with NOAA and the greater user community. And so here is just a couple of tools that they provide, whether it's modeling sea level rise or inundation mapping. You can really start to do stuff like monitor coastal erosion, sediment transport, like I mentioned, calculating water volumes, all of that stuff. So again, there's a lot to do with this data set. Overall, the key takeaways are that with TOPOBATHY LiDAR, you can cover those hard to reach areas and do so at a larger scale than ever before. You need to know your conditions and expectations. Are you happy with 2 meters, or do you want 20 meters? But in the end, you're progressing these high-resolution data sets from land and taking them into the water to uncover a whole world of possibilities. Thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for that great talk from Quantum Spatial Canada. Very exciting to see all these applications of LiDAR. It's the Q&A portion of the time, and we've got some great questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to start with the first one. It says anonymous. When classifying individual trees, how did you parse our different species in the example you showed?
Yeah, so the way we're doing it in this particular project is we're using a deep learning algorithm. So it does both the shape characterization of the individual trees and the species classification sort of in an iterative manner. One of the key things is to have enough example trees that you can't do this without field data. So you have, 500,000 individual trees. And then what you're doing is trying to match the shape and the color and the structure of those trees in your database with the trees that you're seeing in the landscape. And so we start, like a lot of these algorithms, with the treetop being an individual tree, and then we iteratively allocate space to those trees, and through an iterative process, we'll determine where an individual tree begins and ends, and then what type of tree it is.
Thank you. Our next question is from Diane. Diane asks, we have had a lot of rain this summer. Many ditches are overflowing. Would you recommend TOPOBATHYMETRIC LiDAR for this scenario, or would you be waiting for a drier environment to be a better option? We're in Alberta. You're on mute, Colin.
Thanks. Hi, guys. Yeah, when when I hear the word ditches, I kind of imagine not a really good reflective surface. I kind of imagine grass or dark material. So, and if it's flooded with water, usually that's going to be more turbid water that's in there. So it's probably not going to be the ideal candidate for a topobathy operation. You probably want to wait till normal conditions for something like that. That'd be my first take at it without looking further.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that, Colin. That was great. The next question we have is, again, concerning water. For shallow waters, was the green wavelength selected as optimal to instrument design considerations, water transmission, or background reflectance characteristics? Are there other wavelengths that can be considered?
Yes, to answer the answers right there in the question. Green is one of the optimal laser. The further that, when you look at other color wavelengths, it becomes what's actually available out there, and then eye safety becomes a concern. So these systems all have to go through rigorous, basically eye safety testing, and have to meet certain requirements for operational altitudes and what you can do with it. So the green laser is the sweet spot for that wavelength.
Great. The next question is from Tony. The question is directed to Andrew. We've started to use random forest algorithm with volume sampling data, Sentinel-2 imagery, and other predictor variables to impute strategic forest inventory attributes at the landscape scale for millions of hectares. A challenge we've encountered is getting good tree height estimates using existing EO data. How do you see the solution you discussed today helping with the creation of cost-effective forest inventories at the landscape scale?
You know, it's a very good question, and this cost-effective element is always the critical one. So, you know, the approach that we have taken is the utilization of lidar. You can do forest inventory, and forest inventory is done with a lot of the available EO data, satellite data, Sentinel, such like. There's always going to be some level of limitation because of the inability to get at really good height data. So, you know, so what I would, you know, ideally what you would do is collect the whole area with lidar at some density, because that gives you that height information, it gives you the ground information. And that's sort of the way we as a company have determined to go. There's plenty of other companies who utilize the standard EO data set. If you can't get that, what I would recommend is some sort of stratified lidar survey. So that what you're doing is getting good height data over a more limited area. So let's say you can't afford lidar of the whole area. Use lidar in areas that you can use for training those data, so that you've got better training information in order to create your area-based inventory. And so that's what I recommend. If you're not doing that, you will always hit some level of limitation to that ability to get out heights. LiDAR has really been a game changer in terms of forest inventory, simply because it does give you heights. Radar gives you heights, but not to the level of precision that the LiDAR does.
Thank you, Andrew. The next question is from Peter White. As one goes from clear to muddy waters, does the green LiDAR reflect from the sediments in the water, or do you get a nil signal return, i.e. can you provide information towards optical depth or Secchi depth? Colin, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. That's a good question. That ties into a lot of it ties into the whole how deep are you going to get kind of question too. So the depth performance is limited by that. So inherently there's some kind of measurement of that water clarity. You know, people were trying to look at using that backscatter volume as a kind of a proxy for turbidity. And I should say that these systems are rated kind of by Secchi depth. So those shallow water systems are 1.5 meter Secchi depth. So if you can see 10 meters, you can get 15 mapped if it's a bright reflective bottom, that sort of thing. So that's important as far as we're not providing any of those direct measurements from that waveform on water characteristics at this time. We're looking at using that backscatter to estimate turbidity to improve normalization of that beam. So when you provide that normalized reflectance product, it's more accurate. So it's really tricky because the water is changing in our study area, is changing in the water column. It can get pretty difficult. So it's an area of research for sure.
Thanks, Colin. We're coming up fairly soon to the end of the Q&A, but we're going to try to get through some more questions here. The next one is from Marta. Have you used or explored any kind of machine learning algorithm for topographic lidar?
Yeah, I guess, Andrew, I think that's probably the question that feeds into your presentation a bit and some of the work done with the individual tree segmentation.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the classification, that's what we have moved to the deep learning. You know, I've been doing this for many more years than I want to confess in a public setting. But the methodology has changed pretty significantly from sort of cluster busting 20 years ago. And so the machine learning is giving us, I'd say, a huge step up from the traditional statistical models. And it is the way of the future. It just gives us the ability to do things that we previously couldn't do, as sort of indicated. The one limitation of it is that you do need, as with any large data analysis, you do need a lot of training data to go in to make it good. And so that is probably the biggest challenge to using these sort of deep learning routines, is to make sure you've got good reference data. But if you do have good reference data, then your ability to extract information at a level that was previously you were unable to do is really possible now.
Thank you. We've got a question here from the Geomatics Association of Nova Scotia. Have you done any wave run-up studies using coastal TV LiDAR?
No, is the quick answer for that. We haven't done those type of analysis with the coastal data set. On our end, we've been more providing that for the users.
Okay. Next question from Blair. Are there certain ecosystems where the tree classification works preferably and where it works unpreferably? Right.
Absolutely. You know, there's, as with any classification, there are complex systems and there are simple systems, and the more complex, the more denser canopies, they're going to work less well. You know, I think a lot of the examples that people have been showing are in evergreen, coniferous canopies, and that's because they have a very conventional, very archetypal shape. The challenges are when you move to the mixed deciduous forests, and that things become much more complex. Segmenting an individual tree standing in a park is very easy. Segmenting a number of broadleaf trees standing in a mixed deciduous forest is much more difficult, which is really why we have moved from the geometric to the deep learning approach. And we think that that will start to yield in these more difficult ecosystems, but absolutely there's going to be some ecosystems that will classify very well, and there's some that will be very difficult even with very advanced analysis.
Thanks, Andrew. Another question here from Carmen Finnegan. For what applications are you using UAV-based LiDAR at what scales?
Sven, you want to get that?
Yeah, we do some UAV work. We've done some with thermal surveys. We've done some with forestry, but our kind of core platform for acquiring LiDAR has traditionally been aerial platforms, that's where we typically do most of our acquisition. Andrew or Colin, I don't know if there's a specific use case you might want to highlight here.
Yeah, I just add to that, you know, UAVs have a place, but the place is still relatively niche. They give the impression that they're cost effective, but when you look at it over any sort of significant scale, they start to price out often less than, less effective than people think. So really small jobs, small, less than a square mile. They have application. If you want quick turnaround on the data, they have application. Where in the forestry sector, where I see a potential future is creating those training data sets. And so, to the first one of the earlier questions, which was, how do we get height data with standard EO wide area applications? One of the places that UAVs could play is flying a very high density, couple of hundred acre site, utilizing that as training data for your EO. So in the forestry sector, there is some very localized opportunities, looking at landslides, areas that are dangerous and stuff like that. In terms of wide area collection, they definitely, right now are not price competitive with a fixed wing solution.
Very true. Let's take a last question. What is the minimum point density required to be able to identify individual trees and run the deep learning processes?
Very good question. And I don't have an absolute answer for that. The minimum for any sort of individual tree segmentation is probably going to be 8 points per square meter. We tend to want to push higher than that for more complex canopies. 12 to 16 is preferred. 20 is better. But I would say going below 8, you are not going to get anything. And as your point density increases, the results will improve.
Thank you. So Andrew, Colin, and Sven, thank you so much for being a part of GeoIgnite. As somebody who did early in my career some LiDAR, this was very interesting. Things have certainly progressed in 20 years. I've learned a lot, and thank you as well for being our silver sponsors. We hope that you'll come back and join us and do more work up here in Canada. That's very exciting.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Okay, everybody, we're going into a short 10-minute break, and then we're going to be coming back into a new talk. There's 2 rooms this time, so I will see everybody on the other side. Check your schedule for which presentation you'd like to be in. Thanks, everybody.